courtroom, you know, and the actions of judges, the actions of attorneys in the courtroom, custody cases, you know, all sorts of things, whether the judges or the clients or the attorneys, you know, there's all kinds of opportunities for rampant narcissism and all kinds of rampant opportunities for destruction within that system. Okay, so Renee is here to talk to you about that. So Renee, why don't you start with your first point about the law system, that first question that you'd had on the list, and let's just sort of get the discussion going. Okay, so Renee,
yes, thank you. So so before I start, I want to say I was licensed as an attorney in 2004, and the vast majority of lawyers that I went to law school with, and that I know, their priority is furthering the legal profession and following adherence to the law, and many of them are quite ethical. But we do also know that there's certain career paths that tend to attract narcissistic personalities. And the law profession is one of those career paths. Some examples of others, I don't know if Professor George went over some of the other popular career paths for narcissists, but doctors are known to attract NPD, musicians, even mental health therapists, and teachers even.
Wait, you mean like you and me?
Well, actually, Frank, you tick off the last three boxes there. So musicians, therapists, and teachers.
Why did I invite you here today? This is going to be a pick on Frank hour or something. Okay.
Do they call you Professor George or Frank?
They do. They are, they are very respectful most of the time.
Professor, I'm going to call you Professor George for the time I'm here.
Your honor is good.
You're all right. I'll do it.
Your lordship. King. I'm something is good. Other than hey you or hey asshole or something.
There might be a reason Professor George checks the last three boxes. But yeah, there's certain career paths that kind of is one. Frank, do you want to intervene and ask me a question, or do you want me to keep asking the questions to myself?
No, just go ahead. I know, you had a bit of a list, so kind of run through them, and everybody, feel free to ask questions anytime. Just kind of, chime in, ask questions. You're all on. She can hear you, like I can hear you, so it's all good.
All right. So then my next question to myself, or what is the reason that we would find higher rates of narcissism within the legal profession? And there's a few reasons, but one in particular is, and I consider narcissists as neurodiverse, but narcissists, as opposed to neurotypical people, are kind of extrinsically motivated. So they kind of make decisions in their life based on whether that would garner them to as supply.
Oh, and by the way, Renee, I just wanted to mention, you're not quite synced up, but it's okay. Like we're dealing with it, okay? Yeah, you're about half a second off, but it's okay. Just thought I'd let you know. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So narcissists kind of make decisions based on what would garner maximum supply. and supply for them would be in the form of appreciation, attention, acceptance, inclusion. And so things like appearance, physical appearance, money, and profession can all be kind of things that would garner supply for the narcissist. And so a law degree in of itself is kind of that another notch on the block, so to speak. And so the the mental endurance it takes to become a doctor, become a lawyer, that also is another notch. And so narcissists are very aware of this. Now, neurotypical people might factor into why they choose a particular career path, but it's probably not their only motivating factor. So, if you decide to become a mental health therapist, maybe you experienced something psychologically troubling in your lifetime and you overcame it, and now you want to go out in the world and share your path to healing with others. And that would be more intrinsically motivated. But narcissists tend to be extrinsically motivated in they're very aware of what I would term the food chain. So where they are, where they stand in relation to others. And so, high profile careers to narcissists. And so that would be one reason that, we may see more of a higher degree of them in certain professions. Is there any questions, or should I continue on and wait till the end?
Nope. Keep going.
Oh, okay. So another reason why you might find narcissists in the legal profession. Well, the way lawyers debate is through something called the Socratic method. And in case you haven't heard of that before, it really, if you Google the term, it's referred to as a cooperative, argumentative dialogue. And the basic format being, it's a series of questions formulated as tests of logic and fact that are intended to help a person discover their beliefs about a topic. So we all know narcissists, the typical way many people describe it, meaning they're not opposed to stretching the truth. I think a few years ago, who was the conservative that used the term alternative facts?
That was Kellyanne Conway. I made that up.
See, you're so good. You're so good.
Like at a press
Kellyanne
conference.
Conway.
Yeah, somebody called her on something and she said, well, we have alternative facts. Yeah.
That was kind of the pinnacle of narcissism for me personally, to hear just someone come out and admit that they manipulate facts. I think that reason it was so it was covered so widely in the media is most people don't brag about manipulating facts. And she was so transparent about it that, to me, that was kind of the pinnacle of narcissistic behavior. But it's that, and interestingly enough, an attorney, I know her husband is. So, if you're willing to lie in the legal profession, you can actually you can actually win more cases. It's unethical, and a lot of lawyers won't go there. But if you're willing to, manipulate facts, be dishonest, lie on behalf of your client, you can actually make more money. And what does money provide for the narcissist?
Well,
If
Renee,
anyone is,
Renee, I mean, I've
yeah.
had an attorney say, the facts don't necessarily matter. What matters is who tells the best story. And I'm really successful because I tell a damn good story.
When did you? Oh, I was going to ask you, where did you hear? Did you hear that in court?
I heard it.
You didn't.
Not in a courtroom per se, but I heard it outside a courtroom during a, not a trial as much as a hearing.
Yeah, during a hearing. Yeah.
Yeah, like during a settlement conference type of thing. Yeah.
Not in front of the judge.
Not in front of the judge. But
Most of them would
but
not.
I know, I imagine that the judge would probably agree. I mean, the judge and that particular attorney certainly knew each other pretty well. I know they were golf buddies.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
Yeah. I won that case, by the way.
Yeah, that was who did?
I did.
You did?
Yeah. Yeah. He only charged me about $250,000.
God.
Yeah, for about, I think it lasted about 2 or 3 months, Yeah, it was a bargain.
Oh, geez. Yeah, that's terrible. It really is. But yeah, that could have been a conflict of interest. The fact that they were golf buddies.
Yeah, should have recused himself.
But yeah, so it wasn't your attorney, it was opposing counsel.
No, it was my counsel.
That said that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. There you go. But it worked in your favor.
Oh, yes, it did.
It does sometimes. It does times. So yeah, so if you're willing to lie on behalf of your client, you can make more money in the law, and more money garners more supply for narcissists. It's more attention, more acceptance, more inclusion. It pays for those fancy things that catch the eye. So it's this kind of the practice of law can kind of be this machine that the supply machine that feeds the narcissist.
Well, in the courtroom, isn't it also good for an attorney to not be empathetic? I mean, they're working for their client and they don't care, if their client is guilty or innocent or whatever. It's their job to win. And if they have empathy for the opposing party and they know the opposing party is actually right, they're going to lose the case. Yeah.
Well, and one step further, it might be difficult to be so convincing of your argument if you are feeling this deep amount of empathy for the opposing counsel's client. If you know that you don't really have a valid argument, if you lack empathy, you might convince yourself of your client's righteousness despite the facts. Narcissists are not only good at manipulating other people, they're good at manipulating themselves too. they can almost convince themselves of believing what serves them. And so that is part of what makes the disorder so complex. Should I keep going or?
Yeah. Tessa.
Have you ever had a client that you believe to be narcissistic?
Can you hear that okay? Or do you want me to
I
repeat?
had a little bit of trouble hearing it.
Did you ever have a client that you believe to be narcissistic?
So I was general counsel for a developer here in South Florida. So what I primarily did companies to settle claims, to settle debts. I worked in human resources within our company. I worked with a lot of other attorneys, accountants, and business people. What I did see a lot of being a female attorney in the profession is a lot of passive aggressive male attorneys. I was young when I practiced. It was before I went into therapy. And so I think the interactions sometimes were a bit over the top, maybe borderline emotionally abusive. I remember sometimes thinking, God, I wonder how some of these male attorneys are behind closed doors at home. Back then, I didn't know as much about NPD. I really didn't know anything. This was back almost 20 years ago. But years later, as I started studying NPD more, than I could think back and realize, oh, I was probably dealing with a narcissist that day, or that guy probably is. And I do know a lot of attorneys that practice in my area that are narcissists. They're high profile, they make good money, they're very respected in their field, but I know them personally and I know that they are narcissists.
So what about people that, like, clients that you've had to work with, or or opposing counsel's clients, or especially in development and
Yes.
big bucks real estate and stuff. A lot of those people, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's the
narcissistic.
Yeah, when you're in there trying to settle debts, there's definitely business. I've been alone in the room with businessmen that know that they owe us money, don't want to pay, and are willing to. They're desperate and they're willing to do and say anything to get you off their back. Back in the day, especially around the years of the recession, when people were losing their companies, it was a no man's land. The rules of engagement were watered down in those years. And so we saw a lot of aggressive narcissistic behavior. Ultimately, my company was bought out by another company in the recession years, and we were all pretty callously dismissed from our jobs. So yeah, we saw a lot of narcissistic behavior. In some cases, clearly those people would qualify for an NPD diagnosis. In other cases, we were dealing with just a high degree of narcissism in an area of South Florida. There's certain parts of the country that attract narcissists. New York, California, South Florida is one of those areas. So you run into them. Your chances of running into them here are much more prevalent than in Dayton, Ohio, where I was born.
She's a fellow Ohioan.
And where my dad's side of the family's.
I said you're a fellow Ohioan.
I'm a Buckeye. Yes.
Any other questions about that? What's going on? Okay, so move on a little bit to the ability to understand narcissism, in the courtroom. I mean, you've got judges that may or may not understand the disorder, not even thinking about the attorneys that may be narcissistic, but a judge having to look at victims, defendants, clients, custody cases, what have you. And in those situations, a narcissist can be very damaging to the opposing party, especially in like custody issues and things. So, so what about an understanding of narcissistic behavior, at the top level of courtroom, like within the judges? How good are they at being able to detect what's going on in their courtroom?
So the biggest problem probably in the legal system that is causing this lack of general understanding around particularly narcissistic personality disorder is that there's really a lack of good skilled testimony available. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, most therapists are, I would say, probably never even come out of college and never even heard of the term narcissistic personality disorder, much less be taught an entire class on the subject. And so they come out not even knowing about it, much less deciding they want to be specifically trained in it. There's a lot of confusion about what works. There's a lot of argument, I should say, about what works to treat NPD and what doesn't. There's still a lot of therapists out there that will tell you it just can't be treated, and will refuse to treat anybody that they suspect has NPD. I follow her name is Dr. Eleanor Greenberg. She's out of New York.
Hey, repeat that. That was broken up, Renee. Can you repeat that? Something about Eleanor Greenberg?
Yes. So I follow a therapist, Dr. Eleanor Greenberg, who does specialize in NPD. Her father happened to be a psychopath. So sometimes I wonder if a lot of her education came from personal experience. But she's in her 80s, and she will tell you, she refers to them as high splash clients, meaning they're a pain in the ass. They are litigious. They will call you all hours of the day expecting you to drop what you're doing. And some of them are reasonable, but as she's gotten into her later years, she doesn't want to deal with it anymore. Does a therapist want to risk being called on to lie against somebody with high narcissistic traits? What are the implications of that? If we all know that people with narcissistic personality disorder, as opposed to even borderline personality disorder, they project their problems onto everyone else. They don't see themselves as the problem. Therefore, they don't really volunteer to get therapy. So in a court of law, if a lawyer wants to present evidence that opposing counsel's client has NPD, is testimony from a therapist who has never who has never conducted therapy with that opposing counsel's client relevant in a court of law? So it's testimony to be considered evidentiary by the judge.
So part of
all
what
of-
you're saying, Renee, is that you're sort of referring to the Goldwater Rule. So if I get, or you know, you're a therapist, so you get called on to testify in court as an expert witness, called by, you know, your side, whatever, you know, because they want to hear your expert witness testimony that the opposing person is a narcissist that, let's say, shouldn't get custody, or, you know, or should be imprisoned or whatever. Well, that opposing attorney could say, well, how can you be an expert witness in this case because you've never examined my client? You know, and so the, you know, the Goldwater Rule about
Yes,
how you
Goldwater.
can't, you know, diagnose from a distance kind of thing. And that doesn't apply in other cases. You know, I've testified in all kinds of, you know, drug-related deaths and alcohol cases, and, you know, where people know the facts and what the numbers are. And, you know, if this applies to person A, it's going to apply to person B, and you can do that. You know, in a lot of behavioral disorders, and especially personality disorders, and again, and even more so with narcissism, you know, if I was the opposing attorney, I mean, I would immediately stand up and say this, you know, this witness needs to be removed because they have no standing to be here. They've never interviewed.
That's right. That's
so how
right.
Can
I
you
mean,
have an expert witness?
That's right. Now, Goldwater is a little different because it was based. The rule was made after therapists were making public comments to the press about politicians running for office.
Oh, you mean like Barry Goldwater?
And right.
Yeah.
And so
you know that he said, I don't know if I told you guys this, part of the reason that people were, you know, the psychiatrists were coming out saying that, you know, the guy, you know, his elevator doesn't go to the top floor kind of thing, is that, you know,
that what it was?
oh yeah, and because he was advocating that we nuke Russia while we have an advantage. We have a lot more warheads than they do, so we should get them while we can before they catch up. That was part of his political platform running for president. And so, yeah, a lot of psychiatrists kind of said, yeah, one brick short of a wall, or, you know, whatever, you know, the comments would be. And, you know, yeah, so the APA got sued.
Then when Trump kind of blew all that out of the water. I mean, wow. You know, like, it was like, then you had people like, come on, like, you know, we're not going to talk about the white elephant in the corner. And it really pushed Goldwater to the limit.
Well, yeah, you know, but remember also that in the 1960s, you know, when the whole Goldwater thing happened, the DSM-3 had come out not too long before, which is still very psychoanalytic, you know, perspective. It wasn't as codified, you know, in terms of symptomology and, you know, and things. So it was so much more subjective even than it still is today. And you didn't have things like, here's 50,000 tweets in the presidential archive showing that this person's a narcissist. You know, none of that existed. So today you could say, well, diagnosed from a distance, you know, what do you mean? I've got the website with all his tweets. You know, you don't need to interview this person in person because they're giving you data. Yeah,
so much data.
It's different. Yeah.
That leads to a question though, based on what you're saying. So let's say that there is a lot of information available from the opposing party, that they put things on Facebook and they send terrible text messages that clearly shows that they have narcissistic personality traits, does that make things a little bit more relevant in the court of law?
Yes, it depends on the judge. If you're in family court and a judge is seeing so many cases on child custody a day, some judges are going to be like, you know what? I don't want to see this. I don't want to hear it. It's not evidentiary. Another judge could look at it and say, you know what? Okay, that really obnoxious text message might point to the possibility of a personality disorder. I rule this client gets tested, takes the NPI. I'll wait to see what the results of that. Not too common, and tests are expensive to order, so it could really drive up the costs of a trial. But you are hearing more and more that once in a while there's a judge that'll order them be tested. Now what'll happen is then you get the other opposing counsel saying, well, I want their client tested too. Now it's projection. Who's the narcissist? He is, she is. Let's all get tested, and what comes out of it. Some judges don't want to get into that. No, I'm not psychoanalytic mumbo jumbo, not in my court. If there's not a testimony of a psychologist that's been treating the client, I don't need to hear anything. So, depends.
You just gave the best psychologist answer in the world. It depends. I tell my students, so when you take a psychology class, now you can, go to a dinner party, whatever it might be, somebody asks you a question and you can sound so intellectual. You sort of say, well, good question, it depends. Yeah, you sort of do that intellectual, hand on the chin kind of thing. And yeah.
The hand on the chin is really important. But so that kind of, I think I'm looking in the news, probably in the news, and the narcissistic case that is going before the courts is Johnny Depp filing a defamation claim against his ex-wife, Amber Heard. Have any of you heard of that one in the press right now?
I see some head nods.
So Johnny Depp, Amber Heard, his ex-wife, who was a famous model, went and wrote an article, I guess, a few years ago, claiming that she was the survivor of domestic abuse. She did not name Johnny Depp personally, but she discussed the years of the abuse, which correlated to when she was married to him. So he went and filed a claim against her for defamation. $50 million, I think he's suing her for, saying that article ruined his career and that he lost several big movies as a result. She, in turn, is saying that he physically abused her. And then the new claim that just came out in court today is she's saying he also sexually assaulted her for over a 3-day period when she was blacked out from drugs and alcohol. So he, in turn, his lawyers are saying he's not the narcissist, she's the narcissist. She threw an empty vodka bottle at him and severed the tip of his finger, is what I heard today. So what's going on here? Well, obviously 2 people, both probably have some narcissistic tendencies, but one of them, maybe both, we don't know, because narcissists can attract each other. there's this magnetism, but one of them might be high on that scale, and the other maybe somewhat, but not clinical. But there's a lot of projection going on there. So it's really hard if you're not, if you're not a fly on the wall when these altercations are happening, to know which one is manipulative and which one is the victim.
Other questions? Comments? Insults? I mean, not insults. Yeah.
So judges aren't trained in any type of analysis of individuals or training for NPD. Is that something that you think that should happen, or is there a way that, as counselors or psychologists, you can help a situation like that?
Did you hear that okay?
A little bit. Is there?
Say it again. Say it like louder, if you would, please.
So, do you think that judges should be trained in NPD, or do you just think, is there certain ways that as psychologists or counselors we can help situations like that in court?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's anytime judges can be educated on something that we know they're seeing a lot of. I think the article that you sent me, Frank, to look over yesterday, even went so far as to say which types of legal cases have the most amount of claims of personality disorders in them. And so you see it a lot in family court. You see it in personal injury cases, where one is claiming that the other client is suffering from a personality disorder. So anytime you can educate judges on it, that's ideal. But again, we have to remember that there's therapists that have been educated on it and wouldn't recognize it if it was sitting in front of them in the therapy room. So especially, there's different types of narcissism. And if we're talking about a covert narcissist, as opposed to Donald Trump, which would be considered more of an overt, if you're looking at a covert narcissist, the symptoms probably wouldn't be recognizable in the short period of time that you're standing before a judge that would alert them that further testing was necessary. You could be sitting in front of a therapist for years and the therapist might not pick up on the fact that she's treating a covert narcissist. Yes, I do agree in educating legal professionals. They want to know, they want to learn, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that personality disorders are taken into consideration in a court of law.
Well, it's also, Renee, it's not as common. Let me say it's sort of not as much in the vernacular to talk about narcissism. So for example, in the courtroom, if I was testifying in an alcohol related case where somebody, drove down the highway and ran into a car and killed 3 people or something, and that family is suing the bar that served the person, well, one, the judge knows what shit-faced drunk basically is. The judge knows.
Well, especially if they blew into a breathalyzer and you have a number, that's a test.
Well, yes, there's a direct test, but but even if they arrest the person, they go to jail, and they take a blood sample. You know, I mean, I've seen some, you know, pretty horrific blood alcohol numbers. But, you know, then you have to do all these extrapolations and, you know, so at the time of the accident, what was going on? And, you know, if they have that kind of blood level, then what was it back then? And if that's what it was, then how long have they been drinking? How much had they been drinking? Should the, you know, the bartender, whomever, been able to recognize that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, but that's something that any judge kind of has a familiarity with, you know? But with something like narcissism, it's just not something that's like, oh yeah, we all know about this. You know, so if I was brought in as an expert witness type person, it was really to kind of be the scientist and provide the numbers. You know, like everybody knows the person was like just, you know, drunk out of their gourd. Okay, well, drunk out of their gourd is not science-y, you know? So they bring in someone like me to define what does that mean in terms of how many beers did they have over a 6-hour period, you know, sort of thing. And it's, you know, it can be relatively straightforward. You know, this is not straightforward. It's not something that the judges, you know, can say, oh yeah, you know, based on the comment that your client just made, clearly, you know, a narcissist, and so I'm going to rule in favor of the other party.
That's right.
You know, it's
narcissists can present. Another thing too is, you know, a drunk person generally, you know, is going to appear drunk. There's few. I would say I have a really good friend in Colorado. Her husband is one of the few people that can drink all night long and you wouldn't know he's drunk, but most people you can tell, or they, you know, you can see it. But with narcissists, they can come out looking like a rose. All of us have probably been charmed by a narcissist, and if you're not specifically zeroing in on them, you probably going around thinking they're a great person, because to most people they are, except for the people who know them intimately or personally, do business with them, exchange money, have kids together, their family. Those are the people that really are alerted to narcissistic behaviors. Everybody else is a source of supply. And so in order for the narcissist to garner that supply, usually they have to charm them.
but you know, and it's
That
also
includes judges.
it's also the case that the narcissism, you know, can show up as a symptom that could be a defining issue in a case ultimately, but it's not what the case is about. You know, like someone isn't charged with being pathologically narcissistic, you know, the way someone would get charged with being pathologically, you know, suffering from alcohol use disorder, you know, where that's the focus of the case.
That's
how
that's the premise of the case.
So how drunk were they when this happened, and is that the main factor? You know, you don't see cases where you'd say, well, how much of a narcissist was this person at the time of the incident? You know, it kind of comes up as,
and is it relevant? And that's a good point, Frank. Is it even relevant? If you stole money from me, if you know, if we were in if we had a contract, you breached the contract and I sued you and took you to court and, you know, claimed you're a narcissist, is that relevant to whether or not you breached the contract?
yeah, it might be if you were trying to show that my behavior was an ongoing, consistent, pathologically lying part of behavior, and being a pathological narcissist was part of that pattern. You know, maybe it's another piece of evidence, but no, you're right. Typically, you know, no. So, to talk about custody for a bit, then, because because it sort of relates to that. You've got,
Right.
here's, two parents, they're in court, they're kind of, arguing about it. And oh boy, one parent turns out to be, a flaming narcissist. How's that going to affect the case? What's the judge going to think, or are they going to think? How does that, weave into custody issues?
Yeah, so in most states, custody determinations in court are based on what is in the best interest of the child. And there's a number of factors that determine what is in the best interest of the child. They could take in to consideration financial ability to support the child. All of the different factors can come into play, but generally speaking, what has happened in recent years is the courts try to grant 50-50 custody to both parents, and that kind of came about after accusations of discrimination against fathers in the legal system. They felt like back then, 30 years ago, that was more likely they would award custody or primary custody to the mother, and the father would have visitation. And then all of these discrimination lawsuits started coming out, and that's when the courts went in the direction of trying to grant 50-50. If the courts move away from that 50-50 custody, there has to be a good reason. And so this is where accusations of narcissism can become quite relevant. He can't take custody of our child because he is showing signs of narcissistic behavior. So that kind of, can really turn the direction of a custody case. But with that kind of came the parental alienation movement, which is parental alienation is a claim made by one party that the other parent is withholding visitation for the purpose of being manipulative to the other parent. So recently, in these past few years, you've seen the father's parental alienation movement. Fathers are claiming, I'm still getting withheld visitation with my child because my ex-spouse wants to punish me for leaving her or running around or whatever. So you're seeing a lot of that. Now, I'm sure a lot of men that are legitimately being alienated from their children. Unfortunately, those groups also attract narcissists that project that onto the other parent, when in fact they are the ones alienating their children from the other parent.
So what would be an example of that, like that projection? Like what do you mean by that?
So a narcissistic lawyer who takes their ex through the courts, let's say they are better funded than their ex, so they punish them through the courts by continually filing appeals, draining the ex of money. And what are they doing? They're claiming, let's say they're claiming in court, she's not allowed to take custody on the dates I'm supposed to have custody, or she's, making it difficult for me to pick up my child. When in fact, that's not happening, but it's projection to punish the ex. Because why? Because narcissists think in black and white terms. They don't think like the rest of us. They love you until they hate you. and the love doesn't last long. Most of us can see one another in a reasonable light. Yeah, Professor George, he made some comment, and I'm kind of mad at him, but he's a really good professor. No, a narcissist doesn't think like that. Professor George is an asshole.
Wait a
He loves you
minute.
until you say something. Now he hates you. Those are narcissists think in very black and white terms. And so once the switch is, they go on the attack. They want to ruin you. And many of them are willing to risk their own well-being to ruin somebody that they feel has wronged them. They will take themselves down, cut their own nose to spite their face, drain themselves of funds to drag someone through the legal system. Sometimes the common sense is lacking.
So they'll do whatever it takes to harm the other person, even at a risk to harm to themselves. Yeah.
And even at a risk to harm their children, which is scary. But if you are, in the case of Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, there's physical violence, signs of physical violence there. That brings pictures to people you can see. But there's still this unwillingness for the courts to accept emotional or psychological abuse as abuse. And so that's what I'd like to see the direction of the courts take in the coming years, is being more open to realizing that physical abuse is not the only type of abuse that's actionable in a court of law. And that there is emotional and psychological abuse, and it should be addressed in the courts, especially when it comes to children, because children really end up being the victim in these cases where they're forced to spend 50% of their time with a parent that is emotionally abusive, best parent in the world on the outside.
But best parent in the world on the outside. Is that what you said?
Right.
Right. Any other questions on this? What was the next thing that you wanted to touch on? There's another. Yeah. So another question. Oh, by the way, you have was it your brother? Cousin. Okay. I love this person because he has a cousin that's a drill sergeant, right? Yeah. He's a drill. Yeah. And a flaming narcissist.
Oh, yeah. Super great.
So it's just great. So she asks really good questions.
Frank, do you remember the study on that where I showed you, or you showed me, there was a study of narcissism in the military. So that's another amongst drill sergeants and higher ups, which I never knew.
Just by the way they wear their hats, they're narcissists. I mean, it's just really obvious. So I'm sorry. So what was your question?
So because judges have to have law degrees, right? I'm not wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of being a judge is a higher level with more prestige and whatever else. Isn't it possible that, or probable, I guess, that they themselves are narcissists, so wouldn't necessarily see narcissism as a problem in a case?
Yeah, we've actually talked about that a little bit. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have to be a lawyer, you have to start out as a lawyer to become a judge. And it, you know, you know, being a magistrate can garner a lot of supply. You're holding your gavel, and, you know, comes that, you know, in some cases are huge. So yeah, you know, it's difficult to recognize that something's wrong in someone else when you don't recognize that it's wrong in yourself. So yeah, you know, it's prevalent not just amongst lawyers, but in the legal profession as a whole. Now, what I do want to say about that is there's a lot of people that practice law and that are judges that are not narcissistic, and they suffer just like anybody would from being in a narcissistic relationship. You know, maybe not to the degree of someone that is in an intimate relationship with a narcissist, but if you are working for a boss that is narcissistic and you are expected to operate under their low standards, then that logically affect you over time, but it can physically affect you even. We know that people that have prolonged exposure to narcissistic abuse have higher incidence of autoimmune disorders. And there's actually some clinical research coming out on that. So it's you know, we know that lawyers to accumulate continuing legal education credits have to go through drug and alcohol training classes because there is such a high incidence of drug and alcohol abuse within the profession. And so at one time they thought, well, that's just the amount of hours they work and the stress of the job. But how much is it also related to being in a toxic environment?
But, you know, when we just
Yeah.
talked about the
Questions?
relationship between narcissism and addiction as well, and, you know, it's a toxic environment. I mean, there's a really high comorbidity between narcissists and substance abuse, in particular, alcohol and cocaine. You know, and a lot of the symptoms of, you know, cocaine use are pretty right on with narcissists, right? So, you know, there's just that overall toxic environment. Yeah, if I was a judge, I don't know about you guys, if I was sitting up there, the judge with my gavel all day, you know, listening to, you know, case after case after case, like, I mean, I'd go home and, you know, slug down a few, I think, you know, I mean, you know, like, wow, I mean, it would get to me. I don't know about you guys, but man, it would get to me. Yeah, Pac, you have
Yeah.
a question.
Could you repeat that little fact about the autoimmune disease thing?
What was the autoimmune effect that you mentioned, Renee?
Yeah, so this might apply more in intimate relationships, but we are seeing that there's certain health conditions that seem to arise from people who have been in relationships with people and have suffered with narcissistic immune illnesses,
Say that again,
Hashimoto's.
Renee, say that again. That was breaking up.
So we are starting to see, and the research, I think there's only one study on this, so it's not like a ton of research on this, but they are starting to pay attention to how prolonged exposure to narcissistic abuse can result in certain physical ailments, and autoimmune disorders are one thing that's showing a positive correlation.
Okay, that answered.
Yeah, that kind of correlates with the story. That whole, the divorce thing between a narcissistic partner and a non-narcissistic partner about like draining money from sitting there and like continuing on the court cases and all of that. I've actually experienced that with my own family, and my one parent actually now has autoimmune deficiencies, and they've been with my other family member who's my mom says he's a narcissist. And like, I don't know, that's kind of correlating. I'm like, right here, my brain's firing in all directions. So I don't know.
There's I mean, I had a,
Yeah.
I had a good, I have a good female friend who had the hellish stories that she would tell me about, her ex, and just, he would just do brutal things. He was an attorney, she was not, and he would just drag her through the courts. If she dropped a child off 5 minutes late, boy, the next day she got served.
Right.
Sue her,
Right.
bring her to court, and it all cost her money, had to go to court, had to have to take off work to go to court. He was just constantly abusing her. And the guy was a textbook case.
They use, yes, the legal system becomes a weapon to another weapon in the arsenal to abuse their ex-partner.
Yeah. So, Rick,
So this is more of a general question, but related to relationships and this kind of dynamic. Do narcissists tend to attract people who are more likely to be victimized? And either way, when they have a partner, does that damage that can be done in a relationship tend to make that person a repeat victim? That they're going to get into abusive relationships further.
sort of like people that get into like physically
cycle.
abusive relationships as a cycle.
I mean,
Yeah.
physical abuse, like we know that, but with where it's not physical, but it's more psychological, does that
Yeah.
same pattern hold?
So do you want me to answer that, Frank?
Sure. Yeah.
So we tend to gravitate in relationships to what we're familiar with. And so if you grew up in a family dynamic where one parent was a narcissist, and maybe let's say when that parent was angry with you, they ignored you or they gave you the silent treatment instead of coming to you and saying, let's talk about this. This is what you did to upset me. If you are familiar with the silent treatment in your family dynamics, then you might not think anything is abnormal when a significant other or a spouse gives you the silent treatment when you do something to upset them. So we tend to repeat the patterns that are familiar to us in our intimate relationships. And the only way to stop the cycle is through education. And unfortunately, that's not always enough, but actually the hard work of changing our perceptions and how we engage in intimate relationships.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and that would apply both to the cycles of relationship for like that victim, but also that does mean that a narcissist, that certain people would tend to be drawn to the narcissist in the first place, right? Like prior to any sort of damage that had been done. More or less.
Sure. I mean,
Yes.
yeah. Go ahead.
So in a nutshell, giving a very simplistic answer, narcissists tend to attract people that have also been exposed to personality disorders in their own family dynamic, not necessarily NPD. There's a clinical study that says that borderlines in narcissists attract one another. Now, in pop culture, to the untrained therapist, they'll tell you it's empaths. I'm an empath and I attract narcissists. The clinician might say you're a borderline and that's why you attract narcissists. It depends on who you believe. We also know that narcissists attract other narcissists. So Amber Heard and Johnny Depp could both be the narcissists and they're projecting. But it usually it is somebody that does not recognize liminal red flags that can exist in an intimate relationship, despite how good it looks on the surface.
And initially, they always look really good. They're
Well, the
fabulous,
narcissist gets real.
perfect relationships, and then they're not. Yeah, it's the
Black.
we've talked about it. It's the intermittent schedule of reinforcement. It's fabulous sometimes, and it's horrific, and it becomes increasingly horrific over time. Yeah. So yeah. So you had a question.
I just kind of had an anecdote that might be an interesting study. So when you're in the military, when you get out, if you develop illnesses, you can go through a process to get service-connected disability. And they have started to have presumptive service connection for certain things, and that specifically are autoimmune disorders. So it would be interesting to find out if, some of those autoimmune disorders like fibromyalgia's presumptive service connection. You don't have to have that when you're in, but as you get older, if you've been in for long enough and then in the military and you get it, you can say that it was from your time while you were in. It would be interesting to know if that was from a health connection because you were, exposed to weird, not good conditions, or because of the people that you're exposed to as a military service member.
Oh, that's funky. That's interesting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
It may not be the fumes on the ship.
Right.
It may be the fumes from the toxic gases being spewed out from your commanding officer.
Well, it would be
something.
interesting to do a study that figures out which service members end up with the autoimmune disorders, because if it's like a lot of members of the SEAL teams, well, maybe it's because a lot of those guys are narcissists, for example, or, looking at it in that regard.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I knew nothing about that. Like, it was presumptive relationship. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, about to talk about that. Let's see. We got like about 2 more minutes. Any other questions? Last question. Okay. So Renee, Ms. Albert, thank you so much for being here. Yay, we're glad to have you here. Thank you, everybody.
thanks so much for having me. Hey Frank, can I get a selfie with you guys?
A selfie with us? What? Oh, you mean up in
Yeah.
class? Oh, you
Yes,
know what? Can you
okay,
guys sort of
everyone-
fun, like everybody move over because this camera's only getting, part of the thing.
Thanks. Thank you guys for having me.
So how many selfies a day do you take, Renee?
That was my first one in, God, a few weeks.
Okay, we'll let you
It
off.
won't go anywhere. It'll stay in my phone. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
So do you get a picture? Yes, no, maybe?
I did. I got it.
You did? Okay, cool.
Good stuff.
All right. So thanks, guys. We'll see you next Tuesday. And if we're really fortunate, we're talking about therapy and stuff, Ms. Sanger Albert will be with us again to help us talk about therapeutics. All right. Thanks, Renee. let's
Thanks,
talk
see you
soon, like
later.
the next day or so. I'll send you a note. Okay?
Sounds good. Talk to you
All right.
soon. Bye.
Thanks. See ya.